Thank you everyone for participating in Soil Stories. We're delighted to have you tonight, and we're delighted to have our guest, our featured guest, Charlie Hibner. We're very thankful to have him involved with Soil Stories. He's such a gentleman, and he shares his learning and knowledge with everyone he knows so enthusiastically, and it's inspiring to know Charlie. Charlie has been a soil scientist for NRCS. He's a rancher in a ranch that dates back for decades in his family, and with his stewardship on a ranch that's south of Chama, New Mexico. And as Isabel said, Charlie is a soil health champion, and he's also won the Land Stewardship Award from the New Mexico Association for Conservation Districts. I was very fortunate to be at a field day that Charlie hosted, and with his wife on their ranch just about 2 months ago. And it was delightful to be on that land, listening to the stories from Charlie about the way they take care of it, and what we can learn from the geology and the soil stewardship that is practiced by Charlie. So without further ado, I introduce Charlie Hibner to you all, and we look forward to hearing from him and then having a conversation afterward.
We're gonna, Rob did mention I'm also a soil scientist. I created maps that people use in soil conservation is using land use planning and wise land use planning. So I consider that job very important and very fun too, because we got to spend a lot of time outside, and of course we learned a lot about soils doing that job. So the two things I'm going to talk about today is the soil forming factors. And two things, if someone already knows a lot about what I'm going to say, just bear with me. These are things that most people don't think about too much, but they're very, very important to know. Also, if you have any questions, just hold on to them, write them down, and then when I get done with my time of talking, we'll share all those. I had mentioned that we're going to talk about soil forming factors, and I'd noticed in the internet that now they say there's 6, but I still hold with 5. I think I tried to find out why they said 6, and I think that they separate biotic into animals and vegetation, but we usually combine those two, but they're both important. So real quick, what those soil forming factors are is first the parent material, the climate that exists, both regional and in the microclimate, the topography, and the biotic activity in the soil, both animals and vegetation. Now you might say, well, you're missing one. It's a little bit of a mystery. I'm going to tell you what it is in a little bit. But let's go through these factors real quick and how they relate to each other. First thing I mentioned was parent materials. Parent materials are broken into about 5 different groups. Most common in New Mexico probably is alluvium. Alluvium simply is material that's been transported by water. Another one is aeolian material. That's material that's been deposited by air. You get into the Four Corners area and you find a lot of aeolian deposits, what they call Mesa Verde loess in that area. These are red bed deposits that came off of red bed materials out in Arizona, and we were deposited there in that area pretty thickly. And we also have a lot of those deposits in New Mexico. The third most common probably is, I would say, is residuum. Residuum is parent material that's weathered right in place directly from the bedrock. whatever exists, whether it be sandstone, siltstone, shell, limestone, or other types of bedrock that's weathered right in place. A fourth type is lacustrine. Lacustrine is a lake type deposit that if you get into playas, that's what you would find in playas, that they would be a lake. That's a lake type deposit. It is settled out. It's settled out of lakes and ponds. And then the fifth one is colluvium. Colluvium would be those areas that are very steep and mass wasting processes have been happening. And so you get soils that are deposited on steep cliffs. It's like almost like talus. So those are the different types of parent material that we see around the world. The topography, I think I might have mentioned climate. Let's just cover topography. It is just how the land lays. It can be the steepness, the slope, the aspect, different type of things like that. They have an influence on how soils develop. Climate has a huge influence on how soils develop, both rainfall, temperature, and even the microclimate that exists in soils. And of course, I mentioned the biotic factor, the vegetation, the animals. There's grasses that are different, all kinds of different. Any plant that's growing on the soil has an effect on it. And they also have, and so do animals, and they have an effect on each other, don't they? And we will see that all of these affect each other greatly. Vegetation creates food for herbivores. Animals then leave waste on the ground. That's nutrients for the vegetation. The perturbation from animals, pedoturbation, I should say, puts dents in the soil, maybe churns it a little bit. The water, heat, and wind from the climate affects the soil. The parent materials have a huge effect on the soil because of what you're beginning with. So we have all these things that are affecting soil development. And I missed one factor, and what is it? It's time. The length of time that things act on the soil greatly influence how it's going to develop, how it's, anything will develop with enough time. So here's a good question. If you have a soil in the Soviet Union, let's say, that has the same parent material, the same topography, the same animals, the same vegetation, and the same climate as in New Mexico, will it develop the same soil? Absolutely. If all factors are the same type of soil develops. So now that we kind of have a little better understanding of how we get soil to form, let's talk a little bit about those soil forming, the things that begin to act on all these different things to begin to make the soil. We have a soil, let's just say that we had a big alluvial event and we had a bunch of soil wash into an area and form several feet of new alluvium. And that's day one of that soil. It didn't exist anywhere before. It may have been another soil where it washed from, but it's now a new soil in that place. Things begin to happen. The temperature has an influence on that soil. Rainfall falls on the soil, it begins to move down through the soil. It will begin to carry two things with it as it moves down through the soil. It allows salts that are in the soil to go into solution, and it carries these salts down into the soil. How far does it carry them? Depends on the rainfall event. If the rainfall event was pretty big, it might carry it quite a ways. I kind of laughed a little bit at a weather anchor the other day. I forget who it was, but he said that that we had about 2 inches of rain, and that if we had any more, that it would just run off because the soil was already saturated. And what he is saying is partially true. We know that a soil will hold up to about 2/10 of an inch of moisture for every inch of soil. So what that means is if you have 2 inches of rainfall, it will probably wet the soil down to 2 feet. But there's no reason that it would stop at 2 feet. It's going to carry on down if we have some good factors. We'll get to that in a minute too. So we have rainfall moving down to the soil, moving salts through the soil. We also have rainfall picking up little clay particles in suspension and moving them down through the soil. These two factors are really important because salts generally are not very good for plants. Some are worse than others. Some may not affect the plant so much, but they all affect the germination of the seed. So we don't want the salt in the surface. We want it to move down. That's very good for the rainfall to do that work for us. Moving the clay particles down is good because clay is less permeable than other parts of the soil, other sand sizes. We didn't talk about sand sizes. Let's just talk about that real quick. We consider there to be 3 different sand sizes in soil: sand, silt, and clay. Sand's the biggest. It goes down to 0.05 millimeters in diameter. The silt then goes from 0.05 down to 0.002 millimeters in diameter. And clay is everything smaller than 0.002. Needless to say, clay particles individually are very, very small. You'd never be able to see them, but they all come together to form something that we can see. So, but these clay particles do make your permeability slower in the soil. So we want to move them down through the soil some and let them form. And how deep will they go? Again, they'll go down until they reach a place that the soil is dry, and then they begin to go into the soil and they get plastered there. So we need to talk now about what is happening as this water goes down through the soil. We know that we have 2 different types of clay in the soil. One is a 1-to-1 lattice clay. They don't expand. The clay that people use to sculpture, 1-to-1. The clay that we used in kindergarten to make things, comes out in tubes, different colors. They color it. It doesn't come that way. It's usually a whitish color. That type of soil, it's a kaolinitic soil. They don't expand. They don't contract. They stay the same size. That's why they hold the water very well. They don't let it go. That's why your clay stays pliable in the kindergarten classroom, and if they do dry, they don't crack. But a lot of our soils are 2-to-1 lattice. That means that they expand when they're wet, and when they dry out, they shrink and they crack. But this is good in soil because as the water moves down and saturates the soil up, it begins to expand. The soil expands as the water moves down through it. It presses against itself. Then as it begins to dry out, it makes a little crack. Well, lo and behold, the next time it wets up, it likes the crack that it formed the last time. And it will follow that same crack and begin to make a noticeable crack in the soil. Now, I'm not talking about a big crack like we see in real clay soil sometimes. I'm talking about a micro crack, one that's probably less than a 1/4 of a millimeter in width, or even less. But the important thing about that is that process begins to form what we call soil structure. Soil structure is immensely important in soils because soil structure allows that moisture to move down, the rainfall to move down through the soil. As that, and it tends to strengthen. It gets the structure gets stronger and stronger all the time as time goes by. So what's really, really important about soil structure is that it's a conductivity for the water. We want to get the water down into the soil. We don't want it to run off. Well, let's talk about the different structures real quickly. A horizons, and I mean the horizon that's at the surface, the one that has the highest percentage of organic matter in it, or organic carbon, is also a horizon that tends to have platy structure. That structure tends to inhibit moisture from going through the soil. But fortunately, though, the A horizon does have organic matter, a lot more organic matter than the other horizons. Organic matter is great at allowing the moisture to move through the soil. So we don't really care too much about that platy type structure of the A horizon as long as we have plenty of organic matter, or if the structure is not too thick and not too strong. But below the A horizon, in the B horizon, that's when you get these structures that are longer and they're blockier. There's like subangular blocky structure, and angular blocky, and prismatic, and columnar, and all of these structures tend to let water move down through the soil, and that's very important for what we'd like to talk about when we're talking about healthy soils. Because any way you look at it, the healthiest soil we can get is one that has the most moisture that we can get into it. Moisture is the key thing in the soil. I mentioned these three solid particles of the soil: the sand, silt, and the clay. And except for the organic matter that exists in the soil, we call this the mineral part of the soil. The organic matter, we call it the organic part of the soil. So in that soil structure, let's say, and these structures, they may usually be a half inch, maybe 3/4 inch in size, but within that structure, we will have a lot of void space, even aside from the cracks that are forming in that structure. The void space is actually pretty significant. It is estimated to be about 50% of that soil. So in other words, you only have about 50% solid materials within the soil, and then you would have 50% void spaces. What are those void spaces taken up of? Water and air. So you say, well, the more water we can get in the soil, the better, right? Not necessarily, because if you remove the air from the soil no longer has an ability to pull nutrients out of the soil. The plant roots use oxygen within the soil in order to transport nutrients into the soil. See, we've always heard that plants use carbon dioxide. They only use carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to create plant matter through photosynthesis, but they need the oxygen within the soil to be able to grow, for the plants to grow properly. And so it's good to have that balance, not completely waterlogged. Some people think, well, some water is good, more water is better. No, you reach a point where if you saturate the soil, you will kill the grasses and other things unless they are something that can survive in water, like cypress trees or sedge. A lot of sedges can pull oxygen through the upper part of the plant, and so they don't need it out of the soil. We will look at two other things in the soil that are very important. The other two things are consistence and color. Quickly about consistence. Consistence is simply how strong are the beds in the soil. And that's what we call those. Remember, I mentioned those little structure things that are forming the blocky structure, the columnar or prismatic structure. Those are what soil scientists call beds. Beds are really important to us because they do allow that water transmission. The consistence of that bed tells you how strong that bed will be able to hold together. And then the other thing is the color. Color is very important because it usually is an indication of not just mineralogy, but also the amount of carbon or organic matter that's in the soil. Organic matter is dark. The more we have, the darker the soil is. And in fact, we have a whole order of soil that's set aside just for those dark soils that have a lot of organic matter in it. Now, if it's a dark soil, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's got organic matter. Sometimes there are soils that are inherently dark. But if they are dark because of organic matter, then they fall into a soil order that we call mollisols, one of only 12 soil orders that we have now. So we're going to speak for a couple minutes then about what happens when we get out there and seriously manipulate the land. And I'm not saying that it's not necessary once in a while. I have seriously manipulated the land myself a few times. Robb will tell you that when he came out on our field tour that there's a field that we looked at and it looks pretty good. There's very little sagebrush on it still. We plowed that field 54 years ago in 1961. I was 6 years old and I helped my dad plow that field. Now by plow, I mean disc, with a disc harrow type thing. This was a one-way disc harrow. But we were able to plant grass with just one pass. We only went down about 3 or 4 inches and we removed the sagebrush, and it's still a good field now, 55 years later. But normally, though, I would not want to touch a field at all with that type of machinery, unless, and especially not with a moldboard. A moldboard will go down 16 inches. That destroys a lot of soil structure. Now, if we're only disking down 3 inches and we're in the A horizon, we're only disking the platy structure. Not that big a deal. But if we get in below the A horizon into the B and begin to destroy that good subangular blocky or angular blocky structure or prismatic structure or the even granular, sometimes we have small granules that are formed in structure, and they're pretty important too. And that's what we want to avoid at all means, is going any deeper than the A horizon. And even that only as absolutely necessary, in my opinion. And I think there's a lot to back that up. We want to keep the carbon in the soil by all means. We tend to use organic matter and organic carbon interchangeably. Normally, we have about 0.6 organic carbon percent and 1% organic matter. They're both about the same thing. But any way that we can store that carbon in the soil, or what they call sequester it, that's what we want to do. I think my time is up, but I'll see if there's questions, or I'll turn it back over to Isabel. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. This is wonderful. It's delightful to hear from you, and it's so informative, the wealth of knowledge you have about the soil and what forms the soil, and just all the rich information you're providing to everyone. I was just wondering, before we open up for the discussion, what personally has driven you and led you to become so informed about the soil? What is driving you personally in your life to do this?
Well, when I graduated from high school, I actually was going to become a physicist. So I went to college at New Mexico Tech on a scholarship, and I went through a couple years of learning a lot about physics and chemistry and stuff like that. But after a couple years, I got to thinking, I'd really like to get back out on the land. And my brother had become a soil scientist through training from New Mexico State University. So I actually transferred down there and became a soil scientist. And so never looked back. I had a wonderful career, we usually spend a lot of time outdoors, but if it was stormy or cold, we had stuff to do inside. And some of the stuff was word processing, but a lot of it was ArcGIS type applications, looking at higher photographs and drawing lines on it. It's a wonderful job. There's only one thing I like doing better, and that's ranching. And by the way, I'm actually in the past, I don't know if I mentioned this, but I don't think I mentioned it before that I know of, but I'm also the pastor of a cowboy church. So that brings me some enjoyment too. So thanks, Rob.
Okay, given that sometimes we have a group that's so numerous that it's hard to have a conversation where everyone participates, but we're fortunate that we have an intimate gathering of about 17 folks right now that everyone can chime in to share a comment or a question to Charlie that they have.
Just learn a lot and really, really appreciate the detail of how what soil is and how it's put together.
Thank you, Ann. That's beautiful. And I see you're driving there, so be safe as you drive. And how about Elaine Sullivan?
I just wrote how much I appreciate the enthusiasm that I hear in these soil stories. And thank you for the incredible enthusiasm that you bring, Charlie. I would love to extend Rob's personal question to you and ask what you adore about ranching.
Well, thank you. I grew up on a ranch. Our ranch is kind of out in the middle of nowhere. In fact, you can't see another house in any direction or habitable house. There's the old ones. And so growing up with that type of lifestyle, I just really grew to love it. And when I got a chance to become a soil scientist, it was with the aim that maybe perhaps I would return to the ranch someday. And I eventually, between my wife and I, we were able to save up enough money and buy it from my siblings. And so now we're on the ranch I grew up on. Not in the house I grew up on, though. It was so infested by rats and mice that we didn't want to live in it. So we kind of built another house up on the hill where we can see over the place. It's just never a dull moment. There's always so much to do, and it keeps me busy, but I'm always anxious to get up every morning. But I do sleep in at least till 6 o'clock.
Well, it sounds like
Thanks
your enthusiasm does not extend to rodents in the house.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So as far as the chat goes, and we'll try to give everyone a chance, but Christy Everett asks, how do you recommend rebuilding disturbed soil, Charlie?
That's a good question. It's tough to do it. It's a very intense situation to really do it well. Now, there's different things that people have used to try to get vegetation back on the soils that have been disturbed. And by disturbed, I'm thinking that you're meaning maybe like soils that have been moved and gone down into the sea horizon or even into more raw material and brought up the surface like mining type applications. Let's talk about those ones that are not that. If it's a soil's been disturbed and I mean, I hate to say this, but easiest thing for me is to, as long as I don't have a lot of salt visible on it, just get it reseeded. And I've had really good luck with that. But as far as a soil that's from a talus type, I mean, removal from a mine or something like that, they've done things like trying to feed cattle on it. Hay, the cattle will go in there and eat the hay, and they push the plant material into the soil, add organic matter into the soil. Those things have worked, but man, it's such a broad scope. I'm not real sure I could give any better answer than the simple one of, if you just have a soil that's been eroded or something.
Yeah, I was thinking like roads or, where it's been bladed but not deep, where they've just scraped the vegetation off, maybe like for a road or something. So gone through with a blade. That's what I had in my head.
Yeah. If it's not too steep, I think you can probably have pretty good success with disking and seeding in. But once you get down below that A horizon, everything gets a lot harder. I mean, my disking projects, and Rob can tell you, they're very successful because I didn't disc beneath the A horizon. I stayed up in the upper part of the soil. And once you get down into your B horizons or even C, where you have less organic matter, it's harder. And if you expose any salts at all, it's pretty hard. But yeah, that'd be
So Charlie,
not the
Eugene,
biggest thing. Thank you.
thank you. Charlie, Eugene Pickett has a question for you.
Yeah, I asked this question because it's kind of preeminent right now, but post drought and flood, how will you deal with remediation, on either one or a combination of the two?
Well, so far up here, we're only worrying about drought because unlike the rest of the state, we haven't had any rain yet to speak of. But we do have some pretty big events, but the events here seem to be of minimal damage as compared to other places. We've got a relatively clay soil. It doesn't erode too quickly. It holds in place a little better. Of course, the vegetation, you got a really good strong cover of vegetation. That'll hold the soil. Some of these floods we're getting some places, man, they're devastating because they're so intense. The soil is so dry. That's one of the problems we have. I mentioned that 50% void capacity in the soil. And if it's all air and there's no water in it, which is kind of the case for a lot of places right now, it's really hard for the water to begin to move in the soil. That air acts like a barrier to it. And until you get a little bit of moisture in the soil to act as a conduit to let more moisture through, it's pretty much going to all run off. That's the biggest problem we have with high rainfall events. They really don't do us too much good other than, I guess, filling the earth tanks up. They pretty much just run off. You just can't beat a good, slow, what they call planter's rain. So, yeah, dealing with the drought, that's really a big one, but we haven't had to deal too much with flooding in this area. We get the little local ones, but they haven't been anything too damaging yet. Not like we're seeing in other parts of the state. Thank you.
So Tony wanted to know, how are you managing your brush at your ranch, Charlie?
Well, we pretty much, we're in a zone that it's actually called it's a zone that we're in a zone that has sagebrush. Wyoming big sagebrush primarily as a shrub. So that line where it switches from Wyoming big sagebrush to other species is south of us. And when you cross that line, you tend to get into walking stick cholla and one seed juniper. We have Utah juniper up here and Wyoming big sagebrush, and we tend to have pingway and not snakeweed and a few other things. So the biggest things that bother us probably are the Wyoming big sagebrush and a little bit the pingway as far as shrubs. They're a bother because they take up so much moisture. There's three things that we have used in order of effectiveness would be the most drastic, which is disking. Disking by far gets rid of more sagebrush than any other method that we've tried to use. The other one, the next most effective probably is a herbicide application, a tebutyron or spike is a trade name. It's pretty effective at killing the sagebrush. It will kill pingray a little too if it's applied at a little higher rate. But of course, a lot of people tend to lean away from herbicide type applications. So the next one with that's pretty minimal damage to the soil, adds a lot of organic matter to it, would be bush hogging. And bush hogging works pretty good if you have a good grass base. And that's the same, that's true for herbicide application too. You gotta have a good grass base. If you don't have a good grass base, the sagebrush and pingray is just gonna come right back in because they're getting all the moisture that, they're just gonna come right back. So those three are the biggest thing. There's talk about insects that would eat the sagebrush. If they could develop something that would eat the sagebrush and not bother other things. And I think they're still kind of working on that. I'm not sure where they are on it. That would by far be the best thing. I'll tell you what, we had grasshoppers so bad, we had a plague of them last year. They say a plague is 27 per square yard. We probably had more than that. And they ate up all the grass, and then they got so hungry they started eating the sagebrush. And we have areas out there that the sagebrush is still dead from the grasshoppers. But considering that they ate all the grass first, it's probably not what we'd want to go with. We'd have to go with an insect that would eat just the sagebrush and not the grass too. But I hope that answered, and it was kind of a lengthy answer. I'm sorry about that.
No, that was great, Charlie. And others are chiming in that Sylvia Ernestina really appreciates your talk, Charlie, and she was curious about identifying soil types by the type of wild plants that grow in the soil. So is that something you want to chat on for a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we had half an hour to talk about it, but we briefly mentioned the plants that they grow in the soil and how they will influence the soil, but also we have plants that tend to be specific to certain soils. And we can tell a whole lot about what used to be called a range site is, of that soil just simply by the plants growing on it. We have evolved. We don't call them range sites anymore. We call them ecological sites because we want to include more than just the range in that. All the other biota, plus the shrubs and trees and everything else that grow on it. But definitely, you're going to find when we create a map that would designate a certain soil or a combination of 2 or 3 soils, we will always have that tied to the vegetation. And by that I mean the native vegetation that exists. And every soil is going to exhibit a different type of vegetation inherent for that soil, which makes it pretty exciting, but also makes it very, very educational for us because we can identify these soils. We know what to expect. We just dig a hole to prove that we're right whenever we're a soil scientist. So that's neat. Thanks for that question. That's a great.
I appreciate these questions too. They're wonderful, and so are your answers, Charlie. I was wondering, we have about 10 more minutes before we have the conclusion by Isabel, and I wanted to go around spontaneously to the various participants who haven't shared yet. And is Chrissy H available to ask a question or make a comment?
I am here. Yeah, thank you. I don't really have a question, but I just want to say thanks to Charlie for sharing and to everyone for facilitating this. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. How about Bob Hockaday? Is Bob available?
Sure, I'm here. Charles, is there a way to get organic material in the soil, such as a liquid fertilizer or liquid nutrients that might be able to help restore a soil that's been depleted?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Thanks for that,
Yeah.
that comment. And thank you, Chrissy, for your comment also. It's, there's probably ways to do it. They're going to be expensive. The best way that we can increase the organic matter or organic carbon in the soil is just to take care of it. Try to make sure we have a good vegetative cover on it. I can't stress this strongly enough. If we're grazing cattle on it, use some type of holistic resource type management on it. Rotate the cattle in and out. That's good, very good for the soil. Allows the grass plenty of time to regurgitate. And of course, the cattle being in a more intense type situation will cover more of the soil, knock more of the organic matter into the soil. Just any way we can knock that plant, the top of that plant down, incorporate it into the soil with hoof action, just whatever, that would be good. But as far as just some type of super mechanical way of doing it, I'm not aware of what that would be. I'm sorry I can't answer that part of the question, but just trying to take care of our soils, give them plenty of rest, and just try to make it to where we can get the most moisture we can into it. That's one of the key things.
That's fantastic. Suggestions. I was hoping for the Pata Viva Farm to chime in with a question or comment.
Oh, there we go. Finally got it.
Perfect.
Had to dig it out of my pocket. I'm out in the field working while I listen. Well, I just want to say thank you, Charlie. And I actually was going to ask, you'd commented on sage and brush control. Is anybody using goats or bringing in a variety of livestock to help balance that out?
A good question there. Not too much of expert on what eats sage. I know that they say mule deer will browse it a little bit, but I haven't seen that occur too much. I think they much prefer other things. I've heard that goats will eat anything, but I know we had a herd of goats over west, and they ate everything right into the ground. I mean, they say that goats are known that they're good for eating weeds, and I'm sure that they do, but when they run out of weeds, they eat grass too. And they pretty much ate everything right into the ground, but they didn't eat the sage. So it's really, it's kind of tough to get cattle to eat it. But I know, and let me just say this, I have a good friend, Tommy Casados, that he's been experimenting with putting a little bit of molasses on the sage. And he says he's had good luck with the cattle eating the sage and with that type of application. And I'm kind of curious to see how that works out long term. Because any way you look at it, to me, it just seems like that sage is not a very palatable type thing, especially when it gets kind of over matured. But there's people that know a lot more about that than I do, though. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you, Pata Viva Farm. That's wonderful.
Well, I was just going to go ahead and comment one more thing. That
Sure.
essentially mentions the molasses. I had heard of that for controlling thistles before, to go out and spray them with molasses to get the cattle to control them.
Yeah, good. That's very good. Thanks for that comment.
Is Ralph Wrons available for a comment or question?
All right, thanks, Rob. And thanks, Charlie. I have to admit right off the bat, though, that I joined late, and you may have said this already in your presentation, My question has to do with, because you did express that you live in an area that has not received much rain, while, good portion of the state has been receiving rain lately. Have you found over the years of having your ranch and doing soil amendments and doing them for different types of areas, be they forests, be they farmlands, have you found that with amended soil in low rainfall years that you have been able to continue to have your, ranch, not proliferate, that's probably the wrong word, but you've been able to survive the low water times because of your amended soil, because of your good soil health?
Thanks, Ralph. And yes, thanks for that question. And the answer is absolutely. We've got, I've got probably about 1,200 acres that have been pretty recently disked and reseeded. The one thing that about disking, the soil tends to kind of make a hard surface with time. And, we talked about hoof action, trying to break up that surface thing. And there's a lot of things that cause it. Even rainfall impacting the soil can kind of form a layer that's hard for water to get through. And one thing about disking, it really lets the water in if you don't disc deep, stay up in the A horizon. Well, those fields they're still green right now. All the other fields are pretty browned out. But those fields that have been more recently disked, they're green, and the greenest one of all is the one I did last summer. I mean, it's amazing. When Rob looked at it a couple months ago, it was just barely starting to come up in grass then. We looked at it a little bit. Now the grass is up about 2 foot high, and it's still green on it. So yeah, that's a way to kind of survive a little bit these bad years. But I'll tell you what, I guess maybe I have to admit, as a pastor, maybe prayer is another good answer, because I'd like to get out of this drought and back into our wet years like we used to enjoy in this country. Maybe that's in the future. We'll see. We'll try to survive till then.
I don't think that's in the forecast, but I surely hope that your prayers are answered, because, if you need it bad, then all of your neighbors need it bad. So I hope it works out that way. But as long as you can keep sharing what you've been doing with others, maybe we'll have more folks being able to get through the low rainfall times.
And that's a helpful comment.
Yeah, sounds good.
Go ahead, Charlie.
Just one real quick thing, Rob. Quick thing here, and then I think we're almost out of time. But we have had more rain up north in Chama than what we get here, and everyone likes to go to Chama, and it's because it's greener than we are. So maybe it's okay that we're a little bit drier, because that keeps everyone moving north away from us. So, but and of course up in Chama, they're already complaining about too much rain, so it's that's the other thing I've always noticed, that if it rains, people complain about the rain. If it doesn't, they want it. But this rancher has never in his life complained about too much rain yet. If Noah gets another call, maybe, but not till then. Thanks.
So we are coming down on the final minutes, and Isabel has a closing comment, but I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you so much to Charlie. And second of all, thank you so much to all of the participants on the call today. It's really appreciated, the time that people are spending on this. And just because of the last conversation, there is the report that Isabel mentioned at the beginning that you can find at nmhealthysoil.org, our website, called Building Soil Health. And Charlie is featured on there and tells his soil story in more depth, or in additional depth. And the theme of the whole report is about resiliency that comes through soil health. management principles. And so it's worth checking out. And the link to the report is now in the chat if you're interested. And I know there were a few more people on the call. I'm sorry I didn't get to you, but I do want to give it over to Isabel after a huge thanks to Charlie for this.
Thank you very much, Andy. You're welcome.